Before we uncover the hour-by-hour event that doomed an entire city, hit subscribe so you never miss the next Resident Evil deep dive. This is the full hour-by-hour collapse of Raccoon City, from the first quiet infections to the moment the government erased it from the map. Every bad call, every ignored warning, and every secret that turned a normal town into a nuclear grave. Part 1. Before midnight. The city before the fall. In the mid-September weeks of 1998, Raccoon City appeared to be the crowning jewel of the American Midwest. To the casual observer, it was a thriving company town, fueled by the economic engine of the Umbrella Corporation. The reality, however, was that the city was already a corpse. It just had not stopped moving yet. By September 15th, approximately 30% of the city's 100,000 residents were directly on Umbrella's payroll. This financial saturation ensured that every level of municipal government, from the mayor's office to the RPD, was effectively an extension of corporate interests. While the public celebrated the bright Raccoon 21 urban renewal project, the literal foundations of the city were rotting. The Dead Factory, a waste disposal facility located in the northern outskirts, had become overwhelmed by the sheer volume of experimental biohazardous waste being pumped out of the Arklay Research Center and the underground Nest Laboratory. The first leaks were not spectacular explosions, but silent, microscopic failures. The T-virus had begun to seep into the groundwater through the city's aging sewer system and the overworked disposal facility. By September 10th, Raccoon General Hospital began recording a 400% surge in unidentified skin diseases among the homeless population and sewer workers. By September 18th, these cases had evolved into what doctors frantically recorded as gangrene and uncontrollable aggression. The medical community was under a strict corporate gag order, with Umbrella-affiliated directors ensuring that these patients were moved to isolated wards where they could be studied rather than treated. The city was being consumed from the inside out by a pathogen that the public still believed was a pharmaceutical myth. The inevitable collapse was finalized on September 22nd. An elite Umbrella Security Service squad, led by the operative known as Hunk, raided the Nest Laboratory to seize the newly developed G virus from William Birkin. The raid turned into a massacre. A fatally wounded Birkin, driven by a primal desire for survival and revenge, injected himself with the G virus and transformed into a monstrous entity. He hunted the USS squad through the sewers, and in the ensuing chaos, several vials of the T virus were crushed and leaked into the city's subterranean arteries. Rats, the most prolific inhabitants of the Undercity, ingested the sludge and became the primary vectors for the infection. Before the sun rose on September 23rd, the water supply was compromised, and the rodent population was carrying a death sentence into every kitchen and alleyway in Raccoon City. The city was lost before the first citizen even realized they were sick. Part 2. The first public infections, the night of September the 24th, marked the moment the quiet leak transformed into a public massacre. The primary super spreader event occurred at Warren Stadium during a local football game. With thousands of people packed into a confined space, the conditions were perfect for a biological flashpoint. The T virus, which had been incubating in those who had ingested contaminated water over the previous 48 hours, began to reach its symptomatic peak simultaneously across the stadium. It was no longer a hidden medical mystery. It was a visible, violent eruption of primal hunger. Mid-game, as the crowd cheered for a touchdown, an infected fan in the lower bleachers collapsed and immediately attacked a nearby spectator, tearing into their throat with a ferocity that defied human logic. The stadium became a theater of horror within minutes. The violence was not a slow spread, but a chain reaction. As people attempted was biologically incapable of feeling pain or fear. The chaos at the stadium served as the distraction Umbrella needed carriers of the T virus. This rapid reanimation cycle was something the local authorities were completely unprepared for. The emergency infrastructure of Raccoon City was designed to handle fires, floods, or civil unrest, but it had no protocol for a cannibalistic riot that was self-replicating. The first responders were the first to fall as paramedics trying to treat bite victims were themselves attacked in the back of ambulances. The thin veil of civilization in Raccoon City was being shredded, and the scream of sirens began to blend into a single city-wide wall of sound. Part 3. The streets collapse. As the clock struck midnight on September 24th, the infrastructure of Raccoon City underwent a total and irreversible failure. The fire department was paralyzed as trucks attempting to respond to the growing number of structure fires were swarmed by marauders on the streets. Firefighters, equipped only with axes and hoses, were defenseless against the swarms of zombies that had begun to congregate in the brightly lit intersections. Public transit was abandoned. Buses were found idling in the middle of streets, filled with the dead and the dying. The power grid began to flicker as unmanned substations failed, plunging entire city blocks into a darkness that was broken only by the orange glow of uncontrolled fires. The city was turned into a massive urban trap. Fleeing civilians, desperate to escape the violence in the city centre, found themselves blocked by massive traffic jams on Ennerdale Street. Thousands of people were trapped in their vehicles, bumper to bumper, as the virus spread from car to car. The sound of breaking glass and screaming filled the night as the infected moved through the gridlock, pulling people through shattered windows. There was no way to reverse and no way to move forward. The very streets designed to facilitate movement had become the city's arteries of death. The police attempts to clear the roads were abandoned as officers were forced to turn their weapons on the crowds they were meant to protect. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the concept of order had vanished. The city services had failed completely. The water supply was a toxic soup of T-virus. The communication lines were jammed by millions of desperate calls, and the hospital emergency rooms had become slaughterhouses. People who had sought refuge in churches or schools found that these safe zones were merely places for the infected to gather. The sheer speed of the collapse was a testament to the lethality of the T-virus when introduced into a dense, unsuspecting population. Raccoon City had become a battlefield, where one side didn't know they were at war and the other side was already dead. Part 4. The Raccoon City Police Department headquarters, a converted former art museum, became the final stand for the city's law enforcement between 1 and 3 o'clock on the morning of September 25th. Chief Brian Irons, who was privately funded by Umbrella, intentionally mismanaged the RPD's response during the critical early hours. He issued conflicting orders, dismantled the STARS unit's authority, and intentionally delayed the distribution of high-powered weaponry from the armory. This left the precinct leaderless and tactically crippled at the exact moment it needed a unified command. Irons was not just a corrupt official. He was an active saboteur, ensuring that the RPD would fail so that Umbrella's involvement could be buried in the debris. By 2 o'clock, the RPD barricades were breached. The massive front doors of the station, which had stood as a symbol of safety, were hammered down by the weight of 1,000 infected. The officers inside, led by the brave but overwhelmed Lieutenant Marvin Branner, were forced into a desperate retreat through the hallways. They were fighting a losing battle of attrition, using desks and filing cabinets to block doors that could only hold for so long. Every officer lost was a double blow, as they would inevitably reanimate to hunt their former friends. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Many officers were seen frozen in shock as they recognized their own family members among the monsters breaking through the windows. By 3 o'clock, the station was no longer a command center. It was a tomb. Small pockets of survivors were scattered throughout the building, barricaded in offices and storage rooms with no hope of rescue. Marvin Branner was bitten while trying to shield a group of civilians in the main hall, a wound that would eventually lead to his tragic transformation. The precinct's radio was silent, save for the occasional static-filled scream of an officer being cornered in the basement or the kennel. The RPD had been set up to fail by its own chief, and as the lights in the main hall flickered and died, the last organized defense of Raccoon City was extinguished. Part 5. Hospitals, Orphanage and Cover-Ups. As the pre-dawn hours of September 25th settled over Raccoon City, the institutions built to protect the most vulnerable became the sites of the most clinical and heartless betrayals. At Raccoon General Hospital and the Alchemilla facility, the atmosphere shifted from medical emergency to calculated abandonment. High-ranking medical staff, many of whom were secret consultants on the umbrella payroll, received encrypted priority evacuation orders. These doctors, who had spent their careers benefiting from corporate grants and black budget research, did not hesitate. They left behind their junior nurses, interns, and hundreds of terrified patients, escaping through a network of reinforced subterranean service tunnels that led directly to Umbrella's private, high-security helipads. These tunnels were not marked on any city map. They were part of a secret infrastructure designed specifically for this moment of corporate extraction. The scenes left behind in the hospital wards were the stuff of biological nightmares. The unidentified skin diseases and acute gangrene cases that had flooded the emergency rooms days prior were actually the early stages of the T-virus incubation. Without the administration of heavy sedatives or specialized containment, these patients began to reanimate in their beds. Nurses, already exhausted and understaffed, found themselves being attacked by the very people they were trying to save. The transformation was not a quiet death, but a violent, spasming eruption of cannibalistic hunger. The hospital halls, once sterilized and silent, were now filled with the sound of breaking glass, the shuffle of dragging feet, and the muffled screams of those trapped in locked wards. The junior staff, having no knowledge of the biological reality of the T-virus, tried to apply standard medical protocols to monsters that were biologically immune to medicine. Simultaneously, the Raccoon City orphanage was subjected to the Silent Seal protocol. Under the direct orders of Chief Brian Irons and his umbrella handlers, the facility was declared a high-risk biohazard zone and locked from the outside. Umbrella personnel arrived in unmarked hazmat gear, but they were not there to rescue the children. Their mission was to secure the premises and destroy the human resource records that detailed years of illegal experimentation. This orphanage had served as a quiet pipeline for test subjects, where children without families were selected for various viral compatibility trials. The records in the basement, which documented the genetic profiles and disposition of these children, were incinerated in portable industrial shredders. The children were left inside the sealed building, essentially buried alive in a facility that had been transformed from a home into a biological tomb. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the healthcare and social services of Raccoon City had officially ceased to exist. The medical professionals who remained were either dead or barricaded in supply closets, while the corporate elite who had engineered the crisis were already miles away in secure bunkers. The fires started by fleeing staff had begun to consume the evidence in the laboratories, and the smell of ozone and burning plastic filled the air. This period represented the death of the city's soul. The abandonment of the sick and the orphaned proved that Umbrella viewed the population of Raccoon City not as people, but as spent fuel in a grand scientific experiment. The city was now a laboratory with no ethics committee, and the sun was rising on a world where the only care available was the cold, clinical observation of a predator watching its prey. Part 6. The military arrives and fails. On the morning of September 25th, the United States Army and National Guard began their full-scale deployment around the outskirts of Raccoon City. Operationally, this was titled a containment and restoration mission, but it was doomed from the first hour. The military command, operating on sanitized intelligence provided by the family and Umbrella-aligned lobbyists, briefed their infantry units on a massive civil unrest event exacerbated by an industrial chemical spill. The soldiers were equipped with standard riot gear, gas masks, and conventional firearms. They were trained to deal with hostile humans who would surrender if overwhelmed or retreat if wounded. They were not prepared for the reality of the T virus, an enemy that did not feel pain, did not follow the Geneva Convention, and did not stop until its brain was physically destroyed. The military established a series of forward operating bases and containment lines at the primary highway junctions leading into the city. As the morning fog rolled in, the soldiers saw what appeared to be crowds of dazed civilians wandering toward their positions. Following standard engagement protocols, the officers used megaphones to order the crowds to halt and disperse. When the crowds continued to advance with a rhythmic, dragging gait, the soldiers fired warning shots. These had no effect. When the order was eventually given to fire for effect, the military's standard aim for center mass training became a death sentence for the soldiers. The infected took dozens of rounds to the chest and stomach and kept moving, their momentum carrying them directly into the military's foxholes and trenches. The collapse of the containment lines was sudden and horrific. In the close quarters of the trenches, the soldiers' superior weaponry was useless. Those who were bitten or scratched by the advancing civilians became new vectors for the infection within minutes. The military's own medical tents, located just behind the front lines, became the new ground zero for localized outbreaks as wounded soldiers reanimated and attacked the medics. Communication between the forward units and the high command in Washington began to break down, replaced by frantic, static-filled reports of cannibals in the fog and soldiers who won't stay dead. The National Guard units, many of whom had friends and family inside the city, suffered a total breakdown of morale. Many soldiers abandoned their posts to try and find their loved ones, further compromising the integrity of the blockade. By 9 o'clock, the iron of the United States military had been shattered by a microscopic enemy. The High Command realized that conventional ground forces could not hold back the tide of a biological infection that reanimated its casualties. The retreat was chaotic, with tanks and armored personnel carriers left idling in the middle of the roads as their crews were consumed by the very people they were meant to restore order to. The failure of the military arrival proved that the T virus was not a riot. It was an extinction event. The military had provided the virus with thousands of fresh, well-conditioned hosts, and a massive supply of high-grade weaponry that would eventually be scattered across the ruins of the city. The sun was now high in the sky, illuminating a battlefield where the world's most powerful army had been defeated by a pharmaceutical experiment gone rogue. Part 7. The city is quarantined. By noon on September 26th, the federal government reached a point of catastrophic realization. Raccoon City could no longer be contained by manpower alone, and it certainly could not be saved. The shift in policy was brutal and absolute. The city was moved from active response to total isolation. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was given the order to destroy the bridges crossing the circular river, the primary exit points for the city's population. Using high-yield demolition charges, the military dropped the Ennerdale and Minton bridges into the water. This was not just a tactical withdrawal. It was a death sentence for the 100,000 people remaining inside the city limits. The sound of the explosions echoed for miles, a thunderous signal to the survivors that the world had officially given up on them. The isolation was accompanied by a massive disinformation campaign. The Department of Defense and the President's office issued a public notice through all major news networks, attributing the quarantine to a catastrophic radioactive spill from a nearby industrial site. This was a calculated lie designed to prevent national panic and to discourage independent journalists or do-gooder rescue groups from approaching the perimeter. By using the word radiation, the government tapped into a primal, deep-seated fear that ensured the public would stay far away. They transformed a biological massacre into a manageable environmental disaster in the public eye. This big lie allowed the military to establish a shoot-to-kill zone around the city's perimeter, without having to explain why they were murdering American citizens who were simply trying to escape a biological horror. Inside the ring of fire, the atmosphere was one of growing, absolute despair. Survivors who had been waiting for the rescue they saw on the morning news realized that the military was now their jailer, not their savior. The city was physically sealed. The circular river became a moat filled with the debris of the bridges and the bodies of those who tried to swim across. The government began to deploy jamming equipment, cutting off the city's ability to transmit cellular or radio signals to the outside world. This ensured that no unfiltered images of the undead or the mutations could reach the global public. The city was being turned into a black box, a place where the rules of the United States Constitution no longer applied. The quarantine period also allowed the family, the shadow organization within the government, to begin negotiating with Umbrella's top brass. They needed time to decide which secrets were worth saving and which needed to be destroyed. The people of Raccoon City were now nothing more than bargaining chips in a high-stakes game of corporate and political survival. By noon, the city was officially a ghost on the map. The streets were filled with the sound of the wind and the distant, constant moaning of the infected, while the soldiers on the other side of the fence sat in silence, waiting for the order that would eventually erase the problem once and for all. The quarantine was the final betrayal of the social contract, proving that the state would rather burn its own citizens than admit to the existence of the T virus. Part 8. Umbrella Goes Dark. As the clock moved into the early afternoon of the quarantine, Umbrella Corporation officially went dark. This was not a failure of their systems, but a deliberate execution of their end-of-life corporate protocols for the Raccoon City branch. They dissolved all Bright Raccoon contracts and terminated the city's municipal power and communication links to non-essential sectors. The city's residential districts went cold, and the remaining landline telephones became dead weight. This strategic blackout served a dual purpose. It prevented the transmission of any unauthorized laboratory data from the city's local area network, and it plunged the survivors into a state of sensory deprivation that made them easier to manage and easier for the biological weapons to hunt. While the city died in the dark, Umbrella's private facilities, such as the Nest and the Dead Factory, remained fully powered by independent geothermal and diesel generators. These facilities became hives of activity as Umbrella's internal security teams worked to pack up essential research and prepare the labs for self-destruction. This period also saw the deployment of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS. These mercenaries, many of whom were recruited from the ranks of international war criminals and guerrillas, were dropped into the city under the guise of a humanitarian mission. They were told they were there to evacuate civilians and restore order. In reality, they were live combat data assets. Umbrella's monitors, stationed in secure off-site locations, watched through citywide surveillance cameras as the UBCS squads were systematically picked apart by the T-virus mutations. The UBCS was a disposable army. They were given outdated tactical maps and were intentionally directed into hot zones where the infection density was highest. Umbrella wanted to see how their bioorganic weapons, specifically the Hunters and the various Licker mutations, performed against trained, well-armed human opponents. The mercenaries' struggle was a performance for the corporate boardroom, a way to test the marketability of their biological products. Every death of a UBCS soldier was recorded as a data point in a combat effectiveness report. The sorrow of these men who thought they were fighting for a paycheck and a fresh start was just more fuel for the corporate machine. By 3 o'clock, the corporation had effectively removed itself from the moral and legal landscape of the city. They were no longer a pharmaceutical company. They were the architects of a controlled demolition. The UBS squads that remained were scattered and leaderless, realizing too late that their extraction was never coming. The corporation had successfully hidden its primary assets beneath the earth, leaving the surface world to be consumed by the fire and the hungry dead. Umbrella was no longer protecting its reputation. It was simply waiting for the evidence to be incinerated so it could rebrand and continue its dark research elsewhere. The blackout was the final curtain call for the city's history. Part 9. BOWs Unleashed. As the sun began its descent on the first full day of the absolute quarantine, the city transitioned from a site of a viral outbreak into a literal proving ground for Umbrella's most advanced bioorganic weapons. This was the moment the hidden war became a visible nightmare. Under the cover of the late afternoon shadows, a specialized heavy transport helicopter, completely unmarked and operating outside of military flight paths, airdropped a massive reinforced container into the heart of the city. Inside was the Nemesis T-type. This creature represented the pinnacle of Umbrella's European research, a T-virus host implanted with a parasitic organism that allowed for high-level cognition and the ability to follow complex, long-term objectives. Its mission was singular: hunt and eliminate any remaining members of the STARS unit. Nemesis was the ultimate assassin. Unlike the mindless zombies, it could utilize heavy weaponry, including a custom-modified rocket launcher, and it possessed a relentless, predatory intelligence. Its presence changed the nature of the survival struggle for those few officers left alive. It didn't just attack, it tracked. It moved through the city with a terrifying, rhythmic purpose, its guttural cry of STARS becoming a death knell for the city's former heroes. Simultaneously, Umbrella authorized the deployment of 6 T-103 tyrants, commonly known as Mr. X, via a separate airdrop over the RPD station and City Hall. These tyrants were designed for a different purpose: retrieval and erasure. Their objective was to locate the G virus sample within the station and to terminate any high-profile survivors who could serve as witnesses to Umbrella's pre-outbreak collusion. The presence of these biological tanks turned Raccoon City into a slaughterhouse. The tyrants moved with a silent, unstoppable lethality, punching through brick walls and crushing the skulls of any survivors they encountered. They were not eating, they were cleaning. They represented the cold, clinical end of Umbrella's bright raccoon promise. The military on the outskirts, observing through long-range thermal optics, saw heat signatures that defied the laws of biology, massive, fast-moving entities that were systematically clearing city blocks. The High Command chose to ignore these reports, categorizing them as sensor glitches, rather than admitting that Umbrella had unleashed gods of war in the middle of an American city. By 6 o'clock, the city's survivors were being squeezed between the mindless hordes and the specialized hunters. The iron of human resilience was being tested to its absolute limit. The streets were filled with the sound of collapsing buildings and the roar of the nemesis, a cacophony of biological horror that signaled the end of any hope for a conventional rescue. Umbrella had turned the tragedy of Raccoon City into a marketing demonstration, showing the family and other potential buyers exactly what their products could do to a modern urban environment. The city was no longer a place of people. It was a museum of the grotesque, curated by the most twisted minds in the pharmaceutical industry. Part 10. As night fell on September the 29th, the final act of the Raccoon City tragedy began with the arrival of two individuals who were completely unaware that they were entering a literal hell on Earth. Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie police officer arriving for his first day on the job, and Claire Redfield, looking for her missing brother, Chris, entered the city limits at approximately 8 o'clock. They were 48 hours past the close of the evacuation window. They found a city of silence and shadow, where the only lights were the flickering embers of burned-out cars. Their arrival was the beginning of a desperate, localized struggle that would eventually peel back the final layers of the Umbrella conspiracy. They were the unreliable narrators who would eventually tell the world the truth, provided they could survive the night. While Leon and Claire were navigating the RPD station, Jill Valentine was fighting for her life in the St. Michael's Clock Tower district. Infected with a concentrated strain of the T virus during a brutal encounter with the Nemesis, her body was beginning to fail. The virus was not just killing her, it was attempting to rewrite her genetic code. She fell into a deep, feverish coma, her survival dependent entirely on Carlos Oliveira, a disillusioned UBCS mercenary who had realized his company's betrayal. Carlos's struggle to find a vaccine in the infested hospital represented the last spark of iron in the UBCS, a soldier fighting for a life rather than a paycheck. Under the streets, in the sprawling Nest laboratory, the G virus was undergoing a terrifying evolution. William Birkin, now a mass of shifting flesh and multiple eyes, was roaming the facility, seeking a host to propagate his new, superior biology. The lab's self-destruct sequence had been primed, and the remaining researchers were being hunted by their own creation. The sorrow of the city was now concentrated in these few individuals: Jill, Leon, Claire, Carlos, and the young Sherry Birkin. They were moving through the sewers and the shadows, avoiding the tyrants and the nemesis, unaware that the gears of the nuclear option were already turning in Washington. By 9 o'clock, the its terminal phase, and the shadows of the city were about to be illuminated by the final, blinding light of a thermobaric strike, party between the United States government and the Umbrella Corporation officially fractured. Within the high-security sub-levels of the Pentagon and the reinforced bunkers of the shadow organization known as the Family, the data being transmitted from the Raccoon City perimeter was no longer fitting the sanitized models of a manageable biological accident. Derek Simmons, the architect of the government's bioweapon containment strategy, stood before a wall of monitors displaying the city in infrared. What he saw was a nightmare of thermal signatures that defied conventional biology. The T-virus was not just killing the population, it was terraforming the city into a hive of mutagenic activity. The panic in the capital was not born of humanitarian concern, but of a terrifying realization regarding viral evolution. Military virologists briefed a shell-shocked National Security Council on the fact that the T-virus had begun to jump species with a velocity that rendered the current military blockade obsolete. They presented evidence that the local avian and insect populations had become primary vectors. If an infected crow flew beyond the circular river, the raccoon incident would become a continental incident in less than 72 hours. The iron of the American military establishment was facing a foe that it could not shoot, bomb, or negotiate with. Simmons, a man of cold, reptilian logic, began to manipulate the fear in the room. He emphasized that the survival of the federal government depended on the absolute erasure of the crime scene. He argued that the American public would never forgive a government that allowed its own pharmaceutical partner to incinerate a domestic city, but they would forgive a government that saved the nation from a catastrophic industrial accident through a mission of mercy. The internal debate was a theater of moral rot. High-ranking generals argued over the payload yield required to ensure the molecular destruction of the G virus, because the G virus possessed near-infinite regenerative capabilities at the cellular level. A standard napalm strike or a carpet bombing would not suffice. The biologists insisted on a total thermal sterilization. This required a thermobaric device of such magnitude that it would effectively create a localized sun on the surface of the Earth. The panic increased as reports came in that the Umbrella Security Service had lost contact with their primary retrieval teams. The Family realized that if the G virus or the T virus data fell into the hands of a rogue state or an independent journalist, the United States would be branded a pariah nation. The decision-makers began to view the 100,000 citizens of Raccoon City not as people, but as leaking biohazardous material. By midnight, the transition from panic to execution was finalized. The bureaucratic machinery of the state began to grind toward the unthinkable. Orders were drafted in total secrecy, bypassing the standard congressional oversight committees. The president's advisors began to prepare the official statement, a masterpiece of double-speak that would frame the coming massacre as an act of profound national heroism. The panic was replaced by a heavy, metallic silence. The men in the bunkers had accepted the sorrow of the sacrifice to protect the iron of their own power. They were preparing to light a fire that would consume a century of American history in a single second. Raccoon City was no longer a place on the map. It was a problem that was about to be solved with the ultimate thermal censorship. The government was no longer governing. It was performing an autopsy on a living city. Part 12. While the tactical bombers were being prepped at clandestine airfields. The hours between midnight and 3 o'clock on October 1st were dedicated to a forensic erasure of unprecedented scale. This was the era of the monitors. Within the burning, blood-soaked streets of Raccoon City, elite umbrella operatives, men hidden within the ranks of the UBCS and the RPD, were executing their final combat data harvest. These individuals were the ultimate pragmatists. They were not fighting to save lives. They were fighting to ensure that the proprietary value of the T-virus and G-virus research survived the coming fire. Using high-speed satellite uplinks, they transmitted terabytes of encrypted biometric data directly to Umbrella's offshore servers. They recorded the exact physiological breakdown of a human host during the transition to a V-Act or Crimson Head state. And they documented the effectiveness of the Nemesis T-type against the final desperate defenses of the remaining STARS members. This erasure was not limited to the city itself. In Washington and across the country, federal agents working for the family were conducting a digital and physical purge of any records linking the Department of Defense to Umbrella's Bright Raccoon project. They were seizing the hard drives of local news affiliates in the Midwest and placing national security gag orders on every telecommunications executive in the country. The goal was the creation of a historical black hole. They wanted to ensure that when the dust settled, there would be no paper trail, no email, and no physical evidence that the United States government had authorized the creation of the very monsters it was about to incinerate. This was the iron of the state crushing the sorrow of the victims' memories. They were making sure that the 100,000 people in the city would be remembered only as statistics in a chemical spill report, rather than victims of a corporate biological war. The cruelty of this period reached its peak with the containment of the uninfected. Satellite surveillance identified several groups of healthy survivors who had managed to reach the outer industrial districts. These people were not targeted for rescue. Instead, Black Op units were authorized to use lethal force to prevent any potential carriers from breaching the final military perimeter. The government was so terrified of a single cell of the G virus leaving the city that they were willing to execute their own citizens on sight. The soldiers on the perimeter were told they were shooting highly contagious biohazards, a linguistic trick that allowed them to maintain their sanity while committing mass murder. By 3 o'clock, the city's communication lines were a graveyard of static. Every radio frequency was being jammed by military-grade electronic warfare suites. The erasing of the truth was a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency. While the people of Raccoon City were screaming for help into dead telephones, the family was already printing the newspapers for the following day. They had created a parallel reality where the city had already fallen to a chemical explosion before the missile had even left the silo. This was the ultimate betrayal of the American people. The truth was being burned away, not just by the coming fire, but by the cold, calculated manipulation of the historical record. By the time the sun began to rise, the story of Raccoon City would be whatever the government said it was. The sorrow of the millions of individual tragedies occurring in the alleyways and hospitals was being converted into manageable risk data, ensuring that the biological age could continue in the shadows, unburdened by the pesky requirements of human ethics or public accountability. Part 13. Between the hours of 3 and 6 o'clock on the morning of October 1st, 1998, Raccoon City existed in a state of hyper-compressed desperation. This was the final window for anything resembling a human escape before the orbital and atmospheric conditions were locked for the sterilization strike. Deep beneath the surface, in the sprawling, sterile nightmare of the Nest laboratory, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the mechanical vibrations of a dying world. Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield were engaged in a frantic, soul-crushing race against a facility's self-destruct sequence that did not care about their heroics. They were burdened by the weight of Sherry Birkin, a child who represented the ultimate sorrow of the biological age, a living vessel for a legacy she never asked for. Their path was a labyrinth of collapsing catwalks and bursting steam pipes, all while being pursued by the final, amorphous evolution of William Birkin. This creature, a mass of shifting biological matter fueled by the G virus, had become a literal wall of teeth and eyes, a biological dead end that sought only to consume the very iron of human resistance that Leon and Claire provided. Their escape via the emergency subway system was a miracle of timing and grit. As the train accelerated through the dark, reinforced tunnels, the Nest facility began to vaporize behind them in a series of controlled, high-temperature thermite explosions, designed to bury the laboratory's deepest secrets. They were racing through the dark, unaware that the world above them was preparing to turn the entire sky into a furnace. On the surface, the city had become an eerie, silent graveyard. Jill Valentine, having finally stabilized after receiving the vaccine for the T virus, was moving through the industrial outskirts with Carlos Oliveira. Every step Jill took was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She was moving through a landscape that had been transformed into a museum of the grotesque. The lickers and zombies were no longer just enemies. They were the environmental backdrop of a failed civilization. Her final confrontation with the Nemesis, now a mutated, tentacled heap of parasitic aggression, occurred in the shadow of a waste disposal facility that was already being prepared for its final decommissioning by the fire. The last escapes were not just about the heroes. Scattered throughout the city, other silhouettes were moving through the shadows. Rogue Umbrella operatives like Ada Wong were utilizing high-tech grappling systems and secret extraction points to secure samples for the organization. Meanwhile, a handful of UBCS mercenaries, realizing they had been abandoned by their corporate handlers, were attempting to hijack any functional vehicle or helicopter left in the city. The tragedy of these hours lay in the thousands of unseen survivors, people barricaded in basements, hiding in attics, or huddled in the corners of the RPD station, who still believed that a rescue was coming. They listened to the distant thumping of military helicopters and felt a spark of hope, unaware that those helicopters were there to ensure the perimeter remained sealed, not to pick up passengers. The silence of the city's radio waves was the most terrifying omen of all. By 5:30, the final few helicopters rose into the pre-dawn sky, their pilots looking down at a city that was already being treated as a memory by the men in Washington. As the sun began to cast its first pale, sickly light over the circular river, the escape window slammed shut. The survivors were now categorized as biological waste by the tactical computers of the United States military. Part 14. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, soundproof doors of the Presidential Emergency Operations Center were sealed. President Adam Benford, a man caught in a web of iron and sorrow, was presented with the final, unredacted, sterilization protocol. This was not a meeting of elected officials, but a gathering of shadow brokers, led by the pervasive influence of Derek Simmons and the military-industrial complex. They presented the president with a series of high-resolution satellite feeds that showed the T virus had officially breached the primary sewer outlets and was beginning to manifest in the local wildlife on the city's periphery. The family used a calculated psychological weapon known as the calculus of survival. They showed Benford a simulation of the virus reaching the Chicago metropolitan area within 48 hours if the Raccoon City hot zone was not physically incinerated. The pressure was not just political, it was existential. They convinced the leader of the free world that the murder of 100,000 people was the only way to prevent the extinction of the human race. The debate within the bunker was a masterclass in bureaucratic dehumanization. The military advisors used terms like target neutralization and thermal scouring to avoid the reality of vaporizing families. They emphasized that the G virus in the city's foundations possessed a regenerative capacity that made conventional explosives useless. They insisted on the use of a high-yield thermobaric device, a weapon that would essentially create a localized atmospheric vacuum of fire, reaching temperatures that would shatter the molecular bonds of the viral pathogens. Benford was told that the civilians left in the city were already functionally dead, their nervous systems likely compromised by the airborne traces of the T virus. It was a lie, a clinical fabrication designed to soothe the presidential conscience and ensure the iron of the state remained intact. The sorrow of the decision was buried under layers of classified data and falsified environmental impact reports. By 8 o'clock, the president's hand moved over the authorization tablet. With a single digital signature, he bypassed the War Powers Act and the United States Constitution, signing a death warrant for a major American municipality. The order was immediately transmitted through an encrypted diamond link to a secret missile silo in the Midwest. The technicians in that silo were not told they were targeting an American city. They were told they were participating in a deep impact environmental remediation strike. The machinery of the state was now in motion, a cold, unfeeling apparatus that had decided that the secrets of the umbrella corporation were worth more than the lives of the people who paid for the government's existence. The countdown began at 8:45. As the president sat in the sterile silence of the bunker, he was no longer a leader. He was an accomplice. The order was a confession of total failure, an admission that the only way to deal with the biological age was to burn the evidence of its birth. The world was about to be changed by a flash of light that would serve as the ultimate thermal censorship of the truth. Part 15. The Nuclear Strike. At 10:29, on the morning of October 1st, 1998, the atmosphere over Raccoon City was shattered by the arrival of the sterilization missile. Traveling at Mach 5, the projectile was not a conventional warhead, but a multi-stage thermobaric delivery system. It did not strike the ground. It was programmed for a high-altitude airburst exactly 2,000 feet above the city center. This was a tactical choice designed to maximize the thermal footprint and ensure that the pressure wave reached into every alleyway, basement, and subterranean tunnel. For the survivors on the outskirts, the first sensation was not sound, but a light so intense it bypassed the eyelids. It was a white, blinding void that turned the morning sky into a scorched sheet of paper. In that microsecond, the iron of the city, the skyscrapers, the bridges, and the statues was converted into a silhouette. Their shadows burned permanently into the concrete before the concrete itself was pulverized. The explosion created a localized firestorm of unprecedented magnitude. The thermobaric payload dispersed a fine aerosol of flammable material across a 10-mile radius before igniting it in a single, catastrophic heartbeat. This created a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of every room in the city, effectively suffocating the T virus and G virus hosts before the heat arrived to finish the job. Then came the fire. At the heart of the blast, temperatures reached several million degrees, a level of heat that vaporized the human body instantly. There was no pain for those at ground zero, There was only a transition from being to non-being. The sorrow of the city was silenced in a heartbeat. The RPD station, the clock tower, and the orphanage were reduced to their atomic components, and the secrets of the Umbrella Corporation were fused into a layer of radioactive glass. The G-virus samples that William Birkin had died for were scorched out of existence, their mutagenic potential neutralized by the raw kinetic power of the sun. By 11 o'clock, the mushroom cloud began to dominate the horizon, a dark, churning monument to the death of an American city. The shockwave had traveled outward for over 50 miles, shattering windows and triggering seismic alarms as far away as Stoneville. The military blockade, situated just outside the kill zone, felt the atmospheric pressure change like a physical blow. The soldiers stood in silent awe, watching the ash of their fellow citizens fall from the sky like grey snow. The government immediately moved to the final phase of the big lie, releasing a pre-recorded statement that an unprecedented industrial chemical detonation had occurred during the decommissioning of a hazardous waste site. The nuclear strike was the ultimate victory for the family and Umbrella. They had successfully used the ultimate weapon of the 20th century to bury the ultimate mistake of the 21st. As the smoke cleared, Raccoon City was no longer a place of streets and memories. It was a radioactive scar on the heart of the country, a warning to a world that was already infected by the secret legacy of the fire. Part 16. Hours after impact. What survived the blast? As the radioactive soot began to settle over the scorched remains of the Midwestern landscape on the afternoon of October 1st, 1998, a chilling reality began to emerge within the classified monitoring stations of the global intelligence community. The thermobaric strike had been designed for total sterilization, yet the iron of Umbrella's engineering proved more resilient than the government had anticipated. While the surface of Raccoon City had been turned into a field of black glass and pulverized concrete, the deepest levels of the subterranean infrastructure remained physically intact. Facilities like the lowest substrata of the nest and the specialized containment vaults of the Umbrella Research Center were hardened against seismic and thermal shocks. These were not just laboratories. They were biological bunkers built to withstand the very apocalypse they were designed to create. In the hours following the impact, specialized hazardous retrieval teams from a rival organization, led by the shadowy interests of Albert Wesker, began to move toward the perimeter. These were not government soldiers, but elite organization operatives, equipped with experimental anti-radiation gear and biometric scanners. They knew that the sorrow of the city's destruction had created a perfect veil of smoke for their own operations. Their objective was the recovery of hardened assets. They were looking for the viral samples and combat data drives that had been shielded by miles of reinforced concrete and lead lining. As they descended into the cracked service tunnels that bypassed the molten surface, they discovered that the T-virus had survived in the most literal sense. In the cool, oxygen-deprived depths, viral colonies remained active in the marrow of charred bone and within the pressurized canisters of abandoned experiments. The survival of these biological samples was the ultimate failure of the sterilization mission. The strike had killed the people, but it had only served to curate the pathogens, leaving behind only the most resilient strains for recovery. Wesker's team successfully retrieved a tissue sample from a discarded fragment of the G-virus host, a discovery that would fuel the next 2 decades of global biological instability. The government's satellites, blinded by the thermal interference and the thick plume of radioactive ash, were unable to detect these small surgical extraction teams. The world was told that the threat was incinerated. But in the dark, the seeds of the next generation of bioweapons were being harvested from the warm ruins. The aftermath was not a period of healing. It was a period of looting, where the most dangerous substances on Earth were being transferred from a dying corporation to a more competent and more ruthless set of shadow actors. By nightfall, the ruins of Raccoon City were a silent, glowing scar. The military had established a permanent exclusion zone, but the perimeter was porous to those with the right technology. The real lie of the strike was already beginning to fester. The government had used its ultimate weapon and failed to achieve total erasure. The biological age was not buried. It was simply moved underground, where it would continue to evolve, unburdened by the oversight of the state or the eyes of the public. The hours after impact were the true beginning of the post-Raccoon world, a world where the monsters were no longer confined to a single city, but were now portable, profitable, and prepared for global distribution. Part 17. Weeks later, the official story. In the weeks following the destruction of Raccoon City, the United States government and the Umbrella Corporation executed a masterpiece of psychological warfare against the global public. The narrative was shifted from a biological outbreak to an unprecedented industrial disaster. The official report, released by a hand-picked commission under the influence of the family, attributed the total loss of the city to a catastrophic gas leak, followed by a series of high-yield chemical explosions at a poorly maintained waste disposal site. The thermobaric strike was rebranded in the press as a strategic controlled demolition, intended to prevent the spread of toxic, non-biological fumes to neighboring states. The iron of the media machine was used to flatten the sorrow of the survivors' testimonies, branding anyone who spoke of zombies or monsters as victims of acute mass psychosis caused by chemical inhalation. Umbrella USA was used as a corporate scapegoat to protect the international parent company and its high-level government partners. The American branch was forced into a highly publicized bankruptcy, and its top executives were investigated in closed-door hearings that resulted in no significant prison time. This was a calculated sacrifice. By killing the American branch, the global entity of Umbrella was able to distance itself from the Raccoon incident while continuing its research in Europe and the Antarctic. The public was given a villain to hate, but the villain was a shell corporation with no remaining assets. Meanwhile, the survivors, Leon S. Kennedy, Claire Redfield, and Jill Valentine, were hunted by federal agents and coerced into silence. Leon was forcibly recruited into a secret government agency, his silence bought with the safety of Sherry Birkin, while Jill and Claire became international fugitives, their true stories relegated to the fringes of the early internet. The big lie was reinforced by the physical erasure of the site. The exclusion zone was declared a national environmental monument, and all satellite imagery of the area was heavily censored or denoised to remove any evidence of the strike's true nature. The government even went so far as to create memorial services for the victims of the chemical spill, using the grief of the nation to solidify the false narrative. The sorrow of the families who lost loved ones was weaponized to prevent any deeper inquiry. To question the official story was framed as an insult to the memory of the accidental victims. This period saw the birth of the modern era. Truth was buried under millions of pages of redacted documents and bureaucratic jargon. The world moved on, comforted by the iron break occurred. The world would be just as surprised and just as defenseless as the people of the Midwest had been. Part 18, The Real Legacy, Why Raccoon City Still Matters. As we stand in the year 2026, looking back at the ash and the sorrow of October 1998, it is clear that Raccoon City was not an ending, but a global ground zero for the restructuring of human civilization. The legacy of the disaster is found in the DNA of every international security protocol currently in place. The destruction of the city proved to the global elite that biological warfare was the ultimate tool for mass social engineering. It taught governments that they could erase a city and rewrite history with total impunity, provided they controlled the narrative and the technology of destruction. The iron of the BSAA and the modern bioterror task forces was forged in the heat of that thermobaric blast. But so was the corruption that now permeates these organizations. Raccoon City matters today because it established the umbrella model of corporate state collusion. The idea that a private entity can function as a shadow government, conducting high-risk research on civilian populations with the tacit approval of the state, began in the Arklay Mountains. This model has since been refined and exported globally. The T virus and G virus were just the prototypes. The modern mold, outbreaks, and the viral saturation events of the 2010s are the direct descendants of the research conducted in the nest. Every time a new variant or pathogen of interest appears in the 2026 news cycle, it carries the echoes of the Raccoon City orphans and the patients of Raccoon General. We live in a world where the real lie has become the foundation of our safety. A world where we are told we are being protected by the very people who hold the matches. The disaster also created a new class of human, the bio-survivor. Figures like Chris Redfield and Leon S. Kennedy are the living fossils of a world that no longer exists. Their iron will is the only thing that keeps the memory of the truth alive. Yet even they have been compromised by the systems they serve. The legacy of Raccoon City is a permanent state of biological anxiety. It changed the way we view our neighbors, our water, and our own biology. It proved that in the age of the virus, the social contract is a fragile illusion that can be incinerated at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, as the family and their successors continue to play their games of global dominance. The ghost of Raccoon City remains a warning. The fire didn't stop the virus. It only gave it a new, more terrifying home in the heart of our institutions. The disaster that changed the world is not over. It is simply waiting for the next chemical accident to remind us that we are all still living in the shadow of the umbrella. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the iron and sorrow of the Raccoon City collapse, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.